Well, this topic's really an interesting topic because what we're finding is we've always had this concept about SharePoint libraries, but what we're calling SharePoint 3.0 is actually how we reinvent SharePoint for the use of AI, because it's becoming, everyone's looking at Copilot agents and how they start to leverage some AI for their business processes. But you have to have that foundational structure right in the first place to really get the full leverage from it. And the main point, really, the takeaway is, if you think about how Copilot currently works, is it just gets all of the content across all of your everything you have access to, whether it's your emails or your OneDrive or all of your SharePoint libraries, all of your teams and things like that. So when you ask it a question, it goes and finds some information and returns back some data. If you can actually specify specifically that you're after this type of information and you can point it to a particular resource, then it's going to give you much better results. So I want you to think about this in two different ways. One is how you can leverage it for AI, but actually, given that we are all still humans navigating the same file structure, I'm going to talk about some of those processes that we can use from a human's perspective as well to make things easy to navigate and easy to find. So yeah, we're calling it SharePoint 3.0. So this is quite an exciting topic for people like me. Don't know if it's exciting for everybody, but it's definitely the future of the way we handle data inside of SharePoint. So yeah, everyone ready? We're going to get started. Cool. To help if my clicker actually worked. Okay, let's get started. Right, so common things that we see, things that across every single folder structure. So traditional folder structures, you get things like, where has someone saved that document? It could be anywhere. It could be in a bunch of nested folders. It could be in Teams. It could be in somebody's OneDrive. It was in an email that was sent to someone. So that's one challenge we always want to resolve, is like, how do you know where to go to find some information? And how do you know when you get there that that is the single source of truth? Like, that is the one document that you need to access. I love this one here, right? So version confusion, right? And I see this all the time. It's the final version, the real version, the final version. And no one actually really knows what the final version is. And some people I see put their name on the end of it because that's their final version, but it's not somebody else's final version. So things like that are really common, and that just creates a bit of chaos as well. So we want to try and solve that problem for humans. And if you think about that scenario, right, you might have 5 documents that are exactly the same. And if you think about how AI reads those, how's Copilot going to know which one the final version is the right one? So we want to address that from both the AI and the human perspective. Okay, and then just think about your manual processes, right? So we quite often see people create folder structures that you have like a to-do folder, and then you might drop the document into a processed folder or something like that. So people are doing a lot of manual workflows to try and get their filing systems working. So I'm going to show you potentially a better way of handling that. I also see, on the same note, I see people that keep spreadsheets that the spreadsheets tell you what the documents are doing. So we can kind of merge those into one single view. So we'll talk about that as well. And then I've talked about it already, but most of it might be invisible to AI, or it's just too much content for AI. So we want to give it targeted and structured content for it to get the best results for you. Okay, so this is the evolution that a lot of organizations have gone through. So you might have had file shares on your server, and so you'd have mapped drives and things like that. And then we've migrated into SharePoint. So you've got now some libraries and some, but basically it's just a folder structure now that sits inside of SharePoint. And this 3.0 is really just around functional libraries. So like very specific use cases for the documents that live in that library. Okay, so this is where we're going to be heading. So what makes a functional library, right? So there's a few key things. So we want to be looking at like custom metadata. So how we're actually tagging and identifying those documents within a library. We can create tailored and custom views so that one team member can see one set of views and another team member can see a completely different set of documents based on their view, right? So it's a tailored experience. And I always think about folder structures is it's only good for the person who designed the folder structure in the first place. So when you think about, you might have a clients folder and a projects folder, and inside the projects folder, you might have, sales and design and finance and all these other subfolders. Now, if I'm the finance person and I want to come in and look at all of my finance documents, all of the invoices that relate to all of my projects for all of my customers. You have to go in and out of every single client and every single project to try and find those documents, or you're trying to mangle through the search to try and get a search that shows you all of those. Whereas if you tagged the document with finance and client and document, I could just filter just by the finance documents that I'm interested in. Whereas the sales team can come in and they can just look at the tagged sales documents. And so they can see all of their records. So no one's really navigating through folder structures. They're just looking at a list of documents and they can apply their own filters and views to figure out what it is that they want to use it for. So that's a kind of good use case. It's just on that client project scale, but we're going to show some other use cases as well. Okay, so if you think about automation as well, so if you start to tag it with metadata, and AI and Copilot can help with this as well. So once you have a document, there's usually a process behind it. So if you think about things like expense claims, so someone drops a receipt or something like that into a folder, now someone has to do a process behind it, whether you're submitting a form or whether you're sending an email or if this is the expense library, you drop the file in, that triggers off the approval notification. So we can handle some of that automation as well. And then governance and retention. So this one is actually becoming quite important when it comes to AI. So normally what I see is a lot of people would create folders like archive folders or old versions of documents and things like that. And I always use the analogy of like price feeds, because if you were to ask Copilot what a price of a product is, you do not want it to give you yesterday's pricing. It has to be today's pricing. So you can't drop yesterday's price feed into a folder called old prices, because Copilot is not going to understand the difference between the spreadsheet that's in the old folder and the spreadsheet that's in the new folder or the current folder. So what we actually want to do is just remove all of that old and redundant data out of your file structure so that both humans and the search and Copilot can return the right information. And then the other thing on governance is just, even if it's not like price feeds, so they have a daily life cycle to like churn out those old prices. But things like policies and stuff like that, like they might have like an annual life cycle. So you might have some governance around those types of documents that would be annual. And you want to apply that at a library level. So you would say that the price feeds library has a daily cycle, but an invoice might have a monthly cycle, and your policies might have an annual cycle. So that's where we start to look at what, at a library level, the content within that library and getting a little bit more specific. And the other thing is, I'm not saying we get rid of folders. It's just, this is a system that can work alongside folders. So if folders make sense in that scenario, use folders. If they don't, then use a metadata functional library. Okay, so here's some examples, right? So I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly, but imagine if you had an HR site. So we always talk about our workspaces being, you have above the line being SharePoint resources, but then you have your workspaces for within your team, which could either be a SharePoint site, or it could be an actual team, and you go to the Files tab of the team. So if you think about HR, right, they have particular resources or documents that they work on. So you might have like onboarding documents, you might have policy documents that need to be read, you might have employee records, you might have performance appraisals and those types of documents. Now they could all have different types of metadata. So if you think about anything employee related, the types of metadata you're going to track with that would be the department they were employed in, their start dates, potentially their end dates. You could have things like who their manager is and stuff like that. And then you can start to build some workflows around those employee records. Whereas policies, you might have who's actually intended to read that policy, and is it part of an onboarding process? And so you think about every type of document might have its own metadata for capturing. And if you haven't seen metadata, I will show you some examples. I'm just giving you some examples here of where it could be applied. Okay, and if you think about the finance team, so any of you guys that are in finance, then you might start to think about, okay, well, we have invoices, we have budgets and reports, and we've got things like statements, we might have purchase orders. There's like a whole heap of like very specific use cases for documents inside the finance team. And so there's some examples there, and I can show you another example of an invoice library, but just again, very specific use cases and workflows that are tied to those types of documents. We've got sales libraries. So you might have proposal management going through stages or phases of a proposal. You might have that connected to all of your clients. You might have what happens when the proposal is accepted. That triggers off a workflow. You might have that now actually signs off on a contract, and it sends the contract to the client to get signed off, and you're capturing the signed version of those contracts. Again, we've got sales collateral. So you can have things like, here's our latest slide decks and all of our pricing materials. And they have a life cycle on them, because as an organization, if you know you've changed your pricing, you don't want that going out on slide decks that people are showing, last year's pricing and things like that. So sales collateral has a life cycle. So yeah, sales have really kind of specific use cases as well. Very different again from finance and from HR. And then under project, so you've made the sale, so then you have project documentation. So, there's things about what have you got inside of the project, how are you delivering that, who the project managers are, who the sales, the original sales content. You've got things like, I see people do product standards or specification sheets and things like that. All of that goes into the projects, and that can all be tagged with some metadata so that then you can leverage that in the future. So you can then start to ask Copilot things like questions like, what was the project that we delivered to this ABC client? And what was the specs that we provided? And it will actually be able to return those because you've identified and tagged those documents with that metadata rather than just relying on the folder structure. Okay. So just remember, this is an evolution, not a revolution, right? So we only really want to implement it where it kind of makes sense to do so. And at this point, I'm just going to exit out of my slide, and I'll just show a few demos. Just so before we go too far down the track, we can actually just talk about what it might look like in real life, right? So as an example, this is not a great example because I've only put 4 documents in here, but imagine this is just an invoices library, only for invoices in a finance team. So you've got here that we've dropped them in and we've created these metadata columns. And so we've got the status of the invoice, and you can see that it's a newly been created, it's under review, it has been approved, and it has been paid. And we can tag it with a vendor, so we actually know who the vendors are for those invoices. We can say who the approver is. So you can see that Diego here is responsible for reviewing this one. And likewise, I'm responsible for actually reviewing this one. So, and then you've got other things here. So like the amount due and the invoice date. Now, the cool thing is we can leverage AI now to actually extract all of this information out of those invoices. So what we could do is connect this library to your accounts mailbox. And as soon as an invoice hits the accounts mailbox, we grab the invoice, drop it into this library. We automatically populate all of those columns, and then we kick off an approval workflow to the approver. If you had things like purchase order numbers, then you can actually reference the purchase order because that would be on the invoice and do a lookup. And you could say, well, like for this example, right, if we had a purchase order that matched $1,050, if it matches, you can maybe auto approve it because you already had approved the purchase order, right? So we can start to build some of these really cool workflows. And if you think about from my perspective, so I come in here, so if I'm in the finance team, then actually I necessarily don't need to use this as my full list because I only really need to look at the ones that are approved. So I could create a view called approved invoices. And from here, these are the ones that I know I need to pay because these are approved and they are not paid. And then I could just change the status to paid. And then, we can even build integration into things like Xero and MYOB to actually process that through. So we can actually take it to that degree as well. But otherwise, we could just keep track of it inside of the system. Then you've got things like my approvals. So as a manager that I have to approve invoices, you can see this one here that's waiting on me. So I'm the approver. So I can come in here and approve and change that status to approved. And then that would trigger off the workflow. And now the other cool thing is obviously we've identified some dates here. So we've got the due date. So I can actually create a calendar view of that column. So I can see that this is when those invoices are due to be paid. So I'm like, okay, well, we've got to make sure we got some money on the 30th. So we've got to pay those invoices. So you think about there's different views for different processes, right? So that's just invoices. But you think of other systems like reports. So you can have stages of reports. So you can have a report that's in draft that hasn't yet been published. And then you can have your published reports. You can have them tagged by the financial year or the calendar year and the month or the quarter or whatever your reporting cycles are. So then you can start to build some of that logic around just reports. So then we would create a separate library for finance reports. And so while I know it's very easy just to come in and go to the documents and you create your folder structures and things like that, actually just have a think about some of those use cases where it could be a separate library with its own metadata structure, and we could build some workflows around it. So you've got this workflow button up here, so we can start to build some of that out. I'm going to show you another example as well. So this is our policies library, and I'm sure if you're one of our clients, you would have seen this many times over. But this is just another use case for metadata tagging within a library. So if you think about this, right, so we've got the categories of these policies. So they are sales documents or service documents or HR documents, and they are policies or procedures. And on this library, we actually turn on what's called publishing. So this is going to fix that version control. So you see this document here, draft with no published version. That means nobody can see that document except for me because I'm currently editing it. So if I was to ask Copilot, I mean, that's got a terrible name, so maybe not that document, but let's take this one, right? So if I was to ask Copilot what our policy is on policy 0068, it's actually not going to return a response because that document actually hasn't been published yet. It will return a response for me because I have access to it, but nobody else. Whereas when I have published the document, then it becomes available to all of the humans and all of the AI agents. Okay, so that's quite a cool column. This is like versioning. So if your documents have a life cycle where you create drafts and then you publish the draft, then that's a really cool feature. So we can start to leverage Copilot to understand this knowledge, this metadata, and those specific documents. Okay, so that's just a couple of examples, but this is across all departments, right? Even like marketing, you might think you have a approved media library. Trying to think, so in board reports, right? So you might have this publishing feature where you have the draft and published versions of board reports. You might have, I don't know, within sales, yeah, different processes, so different columns, and you might then tag it. You might have a client tag column, so you tag it with client, and from there you can then group all of your sales documents by client. You could break it down by region, so you might have the Auckland region, or you might have an Australian branch, and you could break it down by region. So all of that metadata goes into training, and you know the AI agents, and then you can filter down on some of that reporting. So that's the idea and the concept of a functional library. And I'm just going to bring back the slide deck. Okay, so just keep in mind, we only really want to implement this where it actually makes sense to do so. We don't want to convert everything. I kind of see a lot of people with SharePoint, they go to the extreme where they try and figure out metadata across everything. You know, I've seen some people with like 29 different columns. We kind of want to keep it fairly simple and break it down by libraries where it makes sense to do so. So don't go overboard, keep it simple, and keep it where possible that we can start to apply some defaults. Otherwise, you're now relying on human behavior to try and manage some of those metadata tags. Okay, but hopefully that's given you a few examples of what that actually means. And then just to keep in mind, right, so now you're actually creating some structure around those libraries. So you've now got those columns, and this is where you can start to build some of those workflows, right? So you can have approvals, you can have notifications and alerts, you can even generate some documents out of it. So if you had templates with metadata and you have the approved template versions, then you can use that library to generate documents from those approved templates. So that could be quite a good use case. And then status tracking. So if you think about that invoice scenario where we've got the statuses, so you can then actually see all of your documents by those statuses rather than moving things in and out of folders to manage the status. We can actually just do it through that metadata columns. Okay. Right, and as I said, I know I've mentioned it a few times, but the real reason we need to start thinking about this really is just that future-proofing for AI. I see a lot of people saying, well, how can we start to leverage Copilot? And the reality is sometimes if you haven't got some of these structures and frameworks right around your documents, like we still see today where there's businesses with a single library and 1,000 folders and 1 million documents in 1,000 folders. And they're trying to handle permissions at a folder level. If you're still in that structure, then what we need to do is start breaking it up into sites, and then breaking up into libraries, and then actually having those structured use cases for each of those libraries. And then we can start to leverage AI. Because one of the biggest things is people are saying, well, I want to stop Copilot from accessing some of the sensitive information, but we can only disable that at a site. So if all of your documents are in the same site, we either have it on or we have it off, right? So what we actually need to do is isolate out some of those sensitive details, put them into a separate site, and then we can isolate that and say, well, Copilot can't read any of that information. Likewise, the humans can't read it either if they don't have access, right? So breaking it up into site structures is really the key. That's like the foundation. But once you've broken it into sites, then start breaking it into use cases. Okay, so I just want to recap on the value. I know we're flying through this one pretty quick, which is good. But if you just think about it, right? So we're going to start gaining some efficiencies, not only from the human's perspective, but from the AI's perspective. It can help with things like compliance. So if you have any auditing requirements on the true version of a document, like a policy or something like that, then that metadata, that functional library for policies, can really help with things like the governance and compliance reporting. This helps you become it's creating a knowledge bases. So you can actually say, well, I'm going to train it based on this knowledge set, and that makes it AI capable. And it just gives you much better results when it comes to doing those AI searches and the prompts. But ultimately, actually what it does is it gives you scale, right? So while at the moment, you might be able to, between your team, figure out the file structure, and it kind of works for everybody. If you're looking to scale, this is the type of thing that's going to enable that, because you're scaling from both a human and an agent perspective. You're going to need to make sure that you've got some of this foundation stuff right. So have a think about how you could start to implement some of these functional libraries. And if you ever want to have a chat, then just reach out. We're always happy to have a chat about that. I kind of see the future. My prediction is that we'll start to look at functional libraries as a collection and saying, okay, well, next time we roll out an HR site, we're actually going to provision it with these libraries and these metadata columns. And so as we get to work with more and more organizations, we're starting to learn some of these patterns, and we'll just bundle that in as a solution and say, well, okay, well, that's what an HR site is. And then the next level of that would then be to how do we get AI to kind of leverage that data now that we have some consistency around that. So hopefully that's really exciting for everybody. I'm just going to move to the next slide, which we're going to talk about our next event, which is real world AI automation. So if you see here, everyone's talking about AI, but very few people are actually talking about the use cases. So join us in July and going to hear about some of the cool projects we've been working on with our clients and some of the projects we've been running internally as well. And we'll talk about how Copilot has really saved, and we leverage it for some time savings across those projects. So keep that in mind, register if you're interested. But in the meantime, have we got any questions? No? Feel free to fire through some questions if you've got anything on functional libraries. I know it's definitely a bit of a mind shift for people that are still working in folder structures. But if you've done some projects with us, you might have already seen some functional libraries in your workspace. But yeah. Okay. Well, can I get a thumbs up from those that maybe think that functional libraries are a good step forward? Yay, okay, perfect, cool. All right, well, unless there's any questions, more than happy to stay on for a little bit and try and answer some of those.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, good to see you all on. And yeah, the next session is going to be an interesting one, so make sure you register. Good to see you all. Thank you very much.